Hello everyone, and welcome to this video analysing God's Grandeur by Gerard Manley Hopkins. This is the penultimate poem in the anthology that the WJEC have prescribed for the AS English Language and English Literature qualification. Before we take a look at the poem itself, I'd like to take a look at some of the context to understand a little bit about Hopkins himself and a little bit about the world that he was writing about. First of all, he was brought up as a devout Christian man. He was an Anglican and then converted later on in his life to Catholicism. He became a religious Jesuit. He chose a life of restriction to show his devotion to God. So one of the central themes this poem will be about is about the presence of God and how, looking at nature, you will see all of the evidence that you need that God is in existence and God has the best interests of man, far more than human beings, far more than the industrialized society that was developing. Hopkins is famous for experimenting with metre, much more so than the Romantic poets that he looks back to. He shares lots of the natural imagery that appears in Romantic poetry, but he does play around the metre a little bit more. He noticed how most poetry in English seems to be structured from Norman roots of English, and generally poetry tends to be written in feet of 2 or 3 syllables with certain stresses. Hopkins became fascinated with older rhythmic structures of the Anglo-Saxon tradition, poems like Beowulf, and he used this inspiration to test different metres, very much looking forward at creating something a little bit new, a little bit more different. What Hopkins started to develop was what is referred to as sprung rhythm. Sprung rhythm is structured around feet with a variable number of syllables and generally between 1 and 4 syllables per foot, with the stress always falling on the first syllable in a foot. Hopkins saw sprung rhythm as a way to escape the constraints of running rhythm, which he said inevitably pushed poetry written in it to become same and tame. What he wanted to do is imbue his poetry with a greater verve, with a higher sprung rhythm, rather than the traditional rhythm that he felt was a little bit mundane. This makes Hopkins's poetry inhabiting a space in between the traditional poetry and the poetry that was to come in the modernist era. He very much looks back at the poetry of the past and forward at the poetry of the future. And his sprung rhythm anticipates much of the free verse that happens later. His work has no great affinity with either of the contemporary pre-Raphaelite poets and neo-romanticist schools, although he does share their descriptive love of nature, and he is often seen as a precursor to modernist poetry, or perhaps as a bridge between the two poetic eras. As we start taking a look at the historical context, it's important to understand that Hopkins was writing during a time of industrial revolution, specifically the Second Industrial Revolution. As a very devout Christian person, he saw the solution to mankind's problems reverting to the ideals of God, looking to God and following its wisdom, looking to nature and basking in that glory, basking in those gifts sent from God. He didn't like the idea that mankind was following a perceived path of progress through machines and pollution and industrialization. Instead, he feels mankind is on the wrong path, and he wants us to divert away from that future and towards something a little bit purer, a little bit more natural. The consequences of industrial revolution can be seen on your screen, and this is what poets like Hopkins were trying to warn mankind of, that these images on your screen are not progress. They're destroying the natural world, they're having consequences on our environment, and they are ruining our experience of the world too. The first image on the left shows that machinery was starting to replace areas of manufacture and areas of the economy. Many jobs, and famously weaving is one of these, highly skilled jobs requiring master craftsmen were becoming mechanized, meaning that skilled workers were no longer needed. Essentially, human beings were becoming less prized because machines could actually replace their labour. People were flocking to cities, and these urban places exploded in size and population. Houses were built quickly, often to a substandard level, and the movement of so much of the population meant many rural areas became neglected, communities were decimated, and rural areas were sacrificed for increased industrialization. And that imagery is central to Hopkins's poem. We are sacrificing nature, and for what? For greater pollution, for poorer sanitation, and for the health of mankind. Industrialization was polluting the world. Large factories needed power and coal was used to produce it. Rivers were increasingly polluted and waste materials were blighting the landscape. All of these images are negative in the mind of Hopkins. One of the major developments in the Victorian era was the development of a train network that made travelling much quicker and much more efficient. Now, this was incredible Victorian engineering, but train tracks, when laid, carve up the landscape, making nature a place to travel through to get somewhere more interesting rather than an actual place to inhabit. Again, nature is being sacrificed in the desire to speed up human progress and experience. Hopkins did not believe that this Victorian obsession with making progress through engineering, industrialization, and economic growth was progress at all. In fact, a little misanthropically, he once described mankind as backward in its attempts at progression. He didn't see this as progression at all. He saw this as regression. Now we have an understanding of the context of the poem, why it was written, and who is the voice behind this poem. We can start to transition into understanding the structure. And as you can see from your screen or the page in your anthology, the structure is a piece of writing of a clear 14 lines. You can see that the top half of the poem is split up into 8 lines. We can refer to that as the octave, and the final 6 lines is our sestet. So we have an octave followed by a sestet. Here we can see that there is a clear turn in the poem. There is a volta. So once the images of the octave have been developed and created, we then get the change in tone for the sestet. And as you can probably figure out already, what we're dealing with again is another sonnet. The type of sonnet we will be able to diagnose once we take a look at the rhyme scheme. To help diagnose the rhyme scheme, I've colour coordinated the final word of each line, and as you'll see, God rhymes with rod, trod rhymes with shod, and foil, oil, and then toil and soil rhyme. As you can see, we have spent, went and bent, things, springs and wings. What we have is a rhyme scheme that may be diagnosed as ABBA, ABBA, CDC, DCD. That rhyme scheme is very regular, and we can refer to this poem as a Petrarchan sonnet. If we take a quick look at the first line of the poem, which reads, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God," you'll see that this poem does not follow the strict rules of iambic pentameter. It begins with the heartbeat rhythm of da-dum, da-dum, the world is charged, and after that it begins to change, it begins to morph. And this is evidence of Hopkins's desire to move to something different, to add a little bit more energy and to break the patterns that were established in poetry already. So it then shifts to having 2 anapests, and anapests are feet with 3 syllables, 2 unstressed followed by a stress. For example, the end of this line of poetry reads, "with the grandeur of God." What this does is heighten the language. It gives it perhaps a real religious quality in the stresses of those syllables. The poem is written mainly in iambic pentameter, but there are those frequent variations. And Hopkins once said that poetical language should be the current language heightened. Let's take a look at the poem in its entirety. Listen really carefully to the language and you'll start to see the message that Hopkins is so desperate to show the world. God's grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, have trod, have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights of the black west went, oh, morning, at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over them bent, world broods with warm breast and with, bright wings. Let's begin a close analysis of the first 4 lines, the first quatrain. The first line itself is, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God." What you will notice about that very first statement is that it is incredibly clear, it's incredibly definitive, and it really does show that there is not a doubt in the mind of Hopkins. His firm view is that the world is charged with the grandeur of God. The declarative statement and the end-stopped line seem to really highlight how true he believes that statement is. The first 2 words, the world, he's referring here to human creation in its entirety. The entire world, the entire population, every little piece of natural splendour is evidence that God is the almighty figure underneath everything. He continues with the verb charged, and we can refer to this as a dynamic verb in this case. There's a suggestion that the world is filled with excitement and tension and emotion. Every single tiny part of the world is filled to the brim with evidence of God's energy. So it suggests that the world is fully energized due to God. God is filling each moment and area with his magnificence. Charred here could also suggest that mankind are obliged to recognize God's presence in nature. As we continue, you will notice the use of the abstract noun grandeur. And this suggests a splendor and an impressiveness. Grandeur can also highlight the high rank and shows God's position is above all else. It suggests that God is the ultimate authority and cannot be or should not be renounced. You'll notice at the end of this first line, the word God is capitalized. It's monosyllabic at the end of the sentence. The word God is a single syllable, and it's being given the capital which shows it's a proper noun. you'll notice in line 4 that the word men is not capitalized. And what we see is that the humanism of Victorians focused on human progress, and those ideals are being challenged. Just like in the Enlightenment, when the Romantics would fight against those who believed that scientific understanding might be the way that the world can become better, and the Romantics suggested it was through nature that we would actually find answers to questions that were much more profound than just understanding the minutiae of the world. Here, Hopkins is showing us that man comes nowhere near if it is the power of God that we focus on. The second line begins with "it will flame out," and again continues this declarative mood, this declarative tone of sentences. It will flame out, a real declaration there. And the term flame out here, the words flame can be seen as a dynamic verb, and there's a suggestion of something igniting and spreading furiously across the world. Now, God's grandeur can be seen in all of nature. His splendor energizes everything. God being seen in nature is one of the characteristics of Romanticism. Flames are beautiful, flames are mesmerizing, but they must be respected, and they contain a dangerous reminder. So God's evidence, God's presence flames out across the world in beauty, and there's also that dangerous element of if we ignore it. Line 2 continues into the simile "like shining from shook foil." And this simile shows that God's grandeur will spread and meet everything, like light reflecting from metallic foil. God's infusion in nature flashes everywhere for all to see. So just like a magnificent light that shines across the world, nothing spares God's touch. You'll notice the sibilance being used in shining from shook foil, and that sibilance highlights the shimmering light from God, and it is illustrated through that alliterative shining from shook foil. The next line begins with "it gathers." So the previous line began with "it," the third line begins with "it." We've got this anaphora that's being used. "It gathers" shows that it is continuing growth. Now it seems to be completely unlimited in its magnificence, almost as if it continues to grow and grow and grow to a crescendo. Gathers here can be considered as a verb. It gathers to a greatness. And that greatness shows that it is potent and it is beyond human comprehension. There is not a single soul on earth who can truly fathom the power and majesty of God's allure, of God's creation, of God's authority. You'll notice that it finishes again with another simile, "like the ooze of oil crushed." Now this simile shows that God's presence can be seen in the bounty of nature. Whilst it's invisible, his presence is omnipresent. You will see evidence of God in everything you see in nature, and the ooze of oil element we'll take a look at in just a second. The ooze, again we have the verb ooze. It shows that like the oil of an olive, God's presence overflows in all of nature's fertility. Just holding an olive in your hand between two fingers, any slight pressure and oil simply flows from that fruit. If you think about the imagery itself, it's almost like in nature there is an abundance ready to be given, and it is God's presence that oozes out of every single nugget of natural beauty. Like the ooze of oil crushed. We then have a slight enjambment from of oil and then moved into crushed. Now the oil can be seen when the olive is compressed. It also does have slightly negative connotations too, which link into the next lines. So perhaps mankind is abusing some of their powers in extracting the beauty of nature and using it for more nefarious, for more selfish means than just accepting the gift of God. You've probably noticed that in line 3 there are 2 syllables more than we are expecting if we were looking for iambic pentameter. Of oil are 2 extra syllables at the end of that line that may show that God is overflowing in nature, just as this line overflows with extra syllables. Perhaps it shows us that abundant nature of God that happens to be seen in every piece of evidence of nature. You'll also notice that we have the caesura at the end of crushed. You have that enjambment of oil crushed, and perhaps that caesura shows the finality of his statement and how it should not be challenged. The next part is, why do men then now not wreck his rod? And it begins as an interrogative, and it's a real change in tone and language from those first 3 lines. The first 3 lines are all about how God is seen in every blade of grass and every small olive that's overflowing with oil. Here it gives us this confusion as to why mankind is so ungrateful. The interrogative is very much focused on the word men, because this is where the failing comes in. Amidst all of God's beautiful bounty, men do not realize the gift that is given, and they start to deviate on their own path. The word men here juxtaposes that radiance and sublimity of God's nature, and it really does show the blindness of mankind to actually see the gift that is given to them. You'll also notice that the word men has a deliberate syllable stress. Why do men? There is a real derision here of human hubris, of the folly, of the mistakes that mankind make, even though they have someone guiding their path. And it continues with the use of the word then. Why do men then now wreck his rod? Really do show that in the light of all of the clear and tangible evidence of God's presence, why don't man actually obey God? It really heightens the confusion and the frustration you can hear in Hopkins's voice. The last part of the line itself is now not wreck his rod, and wreck his rod is a little bit of an archaism. It's not the type of phrase that you'd hear often in the 21st century, but it means to pay heed to or to obey. A rod might refer to a stick used to punish, or to a rod that belongs to God and is a symbol of God's authority. Now, the archaism may show how God predates mankind and therefore should not be challenged by inferior beings. The poetic voice finds it incomprehensible that mankind can denounce God in the presence of such evidence. And that deliberate juxtaposition between the bounty of God and the foolishness of mankind is deliberate. Throughout these lines, you'll also have noticed that there is really frequent consonants, very frequent assonants, very frequent alliteration throughout. And it may be to show that when describing nature, it illustrates how God can be seen in everything. It gathers to greatness. There's almost a sense of awe about the poet when considering the gifts of God, and again with ooze of oil, almost as if the sound itself is flowing out of these words, like nature has energy and enthusiasm and this gift oozing out of it. Whilst when describing mankind's foolishness, it also shows their naivety, and you can see that through now not wreck his rod. And there's almost a sense of frustration and anger that mankind cannot see what is directly in front of them. If we take a second to pause here and consider the imagery used in this first quatrain, you can see that the poetic voice is suggesting that God can be seen in nature. And those pictures on your screen will really show what Hopkins sees as evidence of God's authority. And he questions how anyone can denounce God in the light of this evidence. Look at the beauty of nature. Look at the sustenance given by nature. How on earth can that be anything but evidence of God's divine gifts? His very direct question, why do men then now not wreck his rod? It is a question that is not actually answered in the poem. Instead, Hopkins moves on to his next quatrain to describe the world created by mankind in juxtaposition to the sublimity of God's creation. So as we take a look at the next 4 lines, consider how different the language is. Consider how the imagery changes from perfect, natural imagery into something a little bit more sinister. The second quatrain begins with the word generations. And he says, generations have trod, have trod, have trod. The word generations here emphasizes the never-ending cycles of mankind. Now there is a rhythm of constant renewal and a rhythm of constant consumption here. Now there is a famous poem called Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats, and in that poem he describes mankind as hungry generations that tread thee down. That description of mankind as consumers who take from the world and don't give it back is not a positive description. So the fact that we have generations here are suggesting that the issues that mankind face are not of a single generation, but of mankind in general. And it is a cycle that needs to be broken, otherwise we are going to continue down a path that will lead to destruction. The next part of the line is have trod, have trod, have trod. Now the dynamic verb trod is the past tense version of the word tread, which means to walk over. Now trod shows how mankind has been present on the earth for a very long time, but it also shows how they continue to damage it. To tread something suggests destruction, grinding nature under their foot, disrespecting the sanctity of our environment. And this continues. This is something that isn't stopping or abating. This is something that is only getting worse. And Hopkins believes this is mankind turning their back on the authority of God. This is mankind turning their back on the gifts that are given by the divine being. The sentence itself, generations have trod, have trod, have trod, you will notice a particular pattern where have trod is repeated 3 times in a row. We can call this epizeuxis. Now epizeuxis is a figure of speech in which a word or phrase is repeated in immediate succession with no intervening words. So here, have trod, have trod, have trod. It's a complete repetition 3 times in a row with no other words in between. This could show the unstoppable and perhaps parasitic consumption and destruction of man. It creates a sense that this will continue despite us knowing that we are destroying the landscape. There seems to be a restlessness to mankind, a desire to continue to move even when we know it is a damaging trajectory. And if you consider the similarities between the voice of Hopkins and those who are conscious of our environment in the 21st century, you may argue that we still do not value the natural world that we rely on. The next 2 lines both begin with the fronted connective or fronted conjunction and this anaphora creates an endlessness to the effects of mankind's destruction. Almost like mankind is going to continue to pillage the earth, continue to rip out the goodness, and to continue to turn what was once pure into something that is purely for the gain of man. And all is seared. The word all here could be considered a quantifier, because it shows how nothing escapes the tainting of mankind's presence. Mankind is destructive and toxic and leaves nothing. We then see the dynamic verb seared, and you'll notice the internal rhyme that continues afterwards. The dynamic verb seared here is imagery of branding. Its industrial language shows the marking of nature and how it's affected due to mankind's desire for possessions, making nature a possession of man to exploit for gain. The word trade continues that thought, and it accuses mankind of exploiting nature for economic growth. Financial rewards are fueling the destruction of the earth. And one of the central pillars of the Christian faith is the idea that greed or avarice is one of the 7 deadly sins. It is one of the things that will naturally make the world a worse place to be. And if you consider, during the Victorian era, there was a divide between rich and poor, where the rich would supposedly own lots of the natural resources, and the poor would have to work in factories to help those richer people get more and more. You can see that that power balance, that imbalance, is something that is only going to make the world a worse place. We then have bleared and smeared. That internal rhyme with seared heightens the destructive actions of man. It sounds particularly unpleasant. It sounds like mankind are having a really detrimental effect on the environment that we live. The word bleared means dim or blurred by tiredness or tears, and there's a suggestion that nature is exploited, causing man and nature to be more distant than ever. And it's tragic. There's pathos being used here, almost like the death of purity, the death of innocence, the death of the natural world. The word smeared means to coat or mark something messily or carelessly with a greasy or sticky substance. And that substance that is smeared all over us is a symbol of our guilt. We are to blame for the ruination of the world. The line ends with toil. The word toil means hard work. The industrialization of the world is being commented on here, because mankind are sacrificing nature for our occupations. Earning is valued much more than preserving. And toil here is not positive. Toil here suggests that we are working on the wrong things. As we approach the end of the octave, it continues, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The verb wears shows that it is totally engulfed with evidence of mankind's neglect, coated with industrial waste, evidence on each of us that we have contributed towards the ruination of the world. And where's man's smudge? You'll notice the word smudged here means stained, because mankind has tarnished nature. And it continues with, and shares man's smell. Mankind has tainted nature with its scent. It is pungent, toxic, industrial, everything nature should not be. And if you consider the difference between how nature is described in the first lines and how mankind's effects are being described now, you'll see a clear juxtaposition. There is irony. Nature gives without demanding anything in return. Mankind takes and then demands more and more. As we move from the line into the next, it then goes back to talking about the natural imagery when it refers to the soil. And soil is absolutely vital to all growth on earth, all life on earth. And here, that imagery of growth and fertility shows how it is being destroyed. And after this enjambment, it really shows the tragedy that this exploitation and destruction is having. Because whilst the soil should be alive with life, the next line says, is bare now. And here, the word bare, which we can classify as a post-modifying adjective, it shows that what should be teeming with life is barren, infertile, completely exhausted. And the implication is that someone is to blame for this, and we should firmly be placing the blame on ourselves. Is bare now, nor can foot feel? The modal verb can shows that through the destruction, mankind has lost the ability to feel the comfort and tranquility of nature. It's like our feet are no longer connected to the ground. We can no longer feel through our feet the world that we once came from. And it shows that industrialization is numbing our experience. We no longer connect to the earth. We've moved too far away from it. The word foot here refers to a bare soul that roots mankind's in nature, and it's a delicate and innocent part of the body. And losing its sensitivity refers to the physical sensitivity as well as the emotional sensitivity. Interestingly, a foot is also a metrical unit in poetry, suggesting mankind is losing their connection with poetry as well. Not only are we moving further and further away from the natural world, we're moving further and further away from being able to create something as pure as poetry. And when he refers to at the end, where he says foot feel, being shod, the word shod here means wearing shoes. And shoes are mankind's creation. Shoes are not natural. Shoes are something that we have invented for ourselves to protect us from pain. And that is a barrier to feeling nature. The suggestion here then is that material goods are blocking the emotional connection. It ends with a very clear end-stop line to show the warning that the further we move away from nature, the further away we move towards something that is much more precarious. Before we move on to take a look at the sestet, I'd just like to pause and take a look at some of the imagery and some of the techniques that Hopkins uses. First of all, the part of the screen that I have highlighted is a use of polysyndeton. and it exemplifies the seemingly limitless scope of mankind's exploitation of nature. The repeated use of synthetic listing is deliberately there to show how it's almost escalating, it's accelerating. We're not abating in any way. Things are going to continue to get worse. It creates an image of mankind being incredibly hungry and refusing to stop satiating that thirst, to stop devouring the world that has been given to us. You'll also notice that the word mans is repeated on 2 occasions, and that deliberate use of the apostrophe of possession, that possessive nature, shows that there can be no doubt who is to blame for the destruction of the nature, and it is clearly labelled as mankind's. Finally, if you just take a look at the meter, you can see that it doesn't necessarily follow iambic pentameter all the way through. And if you take a look at the line, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, you can see the breaking of the iambic pentameter to give us the stresses on the words that Hopkins believes are the biggest crimes that mankind seem to have. Words like trade, bleared, smeared, toil and seared are all stressed deliberately to show his anger and frustration, and to point his finger at mankind, and to lay that accusation of blame very firmly at our feet. Finally, if you take a look at the repeated use of that T sound, the dental plosives are being used, almost like the sound of metal striking metal, which echoes that industrial sound. The world is no longer filled with beautiful assonants and consonants like oozing oil. We now have that much more destructive, cacophonous sound of trod, trod, trod. If you take a look at the images in front of you, this is the juxtaposition that we see in terms of imagery. We move from a lexical set of nature and bountifulness into a lexical set of industrialization and consumption. The natural world is being destroyed, and it's in favour of factories and power plants and oil and smog and smoke and dirt and grime. And you'll also notice that the conditions that mankind are living in are significantly weakened as well. During the Victorian era, the laws surrounding child labour were incredibly lax. What Hopkins was an observer of is that mankind were willing to sacrifice nature and their own health in the pursuit of wealth. And it is something that he considers is not progressive. Moving on to the sestet, we get our volta, and it comes through another fronted conjunction. And there's a clear change in tone at the beginning of this sestate, which you'll notice as we move forward. He says, and for all this, this is him saying that despite all of what he's just said, there is something else that is evident. And what he does is he offers solace. He tells us that there is hope, even with all of the destruction in the world. He shows us we're not beyond salvation. He's not as misanthropic as some of the other poets that we might have studied, because he does believe that everything can change if we just do the things that we need to do. And he says, and for all this, nature is never spent. And that alliteration of nature is never is deliberately showing a power in nature that cannot be exhausted. He tells us that nature is unlimited. It continues to give no matter the neglect, because God is inexhaustible. There's a suggestion that nature will outlive mankind. that nature is the ultimate authority, and mankind is a fleeting presence on earth if we do not listen to the tune of nature. He tells us that nature is never spent, and there is a double meaning here. Its use is ambiguous. On the one hand, it could be meaning of exhaustion. So nature cannot be emptied, it is boundless and cannot be used up. Or secondly, it could be a reminder that mankind is using nature for commerce, for money, a suggestion that nature is not man's for exploitation. The next line begins, "There lives." And here we have a declarative statement, because despite the desolation of the second quatrain, the stative verb lives here shows the omnipresence of God. It shows that God is eternal and immortal and cannot be trodden upon, cannot be squashed, cannot be eliminated. And when he says there lives the dearest freshness, dearest is a superlative, and it shows that a love that cannot be extinguished exists in the world. The word freshness juxtaposes the industrial lexical set that we've seen previously. And he's showing that the world returns to the cleanliness of nature. It's holy, it's indestructible, and it is unerringly loving. The freshness deep down shows that far deeper than the surface, the careless destruction of man. God's eternal presence is far more bountiful than mankind's short-sighted obsession with economic gain. It shows a superficiality to the lives of man in comparison to the endless love of God. The 11th line begins in the same way with the fronted connective and though the last lights of the black west. Here that fronted connective or fronted conjunction begins to demonstrate how nature will never be spent and gives evidence for his claims. The words "the last lights of the black west," that creates an imagery of darkness, and this darkness seems to be advancing. It may be the end of the day, or perhaps the end of an era of time. And the word west here can be considered a metonym for Western civilization. Perhaps the suggestion of this line is that the sun is setting on the Western world. The next line begins with the exhalation, "O morning," and it shows that morning inevitably follows night. Light inevitably springs from darkness. Now, God's presence will always prevail darkness, and resurrection cannot be stopped. And that natural rhythm will not be disrupted. And if there's a suggestion that the day is dawning on one era, and perhaps the light will remain for another era, there is a conspicuous lack of mankind's involvement in the next part of history. Perhaps mankind is slowly disappearing from the world because of its catastrophic selfishness, and perhaps moving forward there will be no place in the world for man. You'll notice the enjambment from went, and it shows the inevitability of day following the night. You'll see the parentheses around morning. Those parenthetical commas give us a pause in the line, and they offer the reader a quiet moment of contemplation, perhaps appreciating the sublime power of the scene, and it offers hope and pride. At the brown brink may refer to the fertile land on the horizon, from which life and light will spring again. And eastward here is perhaps the other direction to where mankind fueling the industrial revolution is. The word springs here, the dynamic verb itself, shows it's full of energy and vitality, and it signifies the destruction of man cannot stem the life of nature. It gives us the imagery of a spring also being water that emerges from the earth. And water supplies life, but it also washes away and purifies. If you think of some of the imagery that we see in the Bible, the idea of dousing at particular parts of the church or particular rituals, we also see it in christenings, and we also, rather sinisterly, see it in Noah. The idea that mankind may be washed away from the world so that it can have a more prosperous future. Throughout these two lines, you'll notice lots of alliteration being used. The first, the last lights, that dwindling and gentle fading away is perhaps deliberate in showing how mankind is waxing away from the history books. The W sound from west wind again shows the disappearing and fading, seamless from one day to the next. And then the use of bilabial plosive alliteration, perhaps used upon the dawning of the new day, to show that there is a brighter future. As we move on to the final two lines, you'll again notice the use of fronted conjunction. This time, the word because rather than the word and. Now, this may demonstrate that there is a reason why mankind cannot dull nature's glory. Perhaps God's power and beauty overcomes everything, even mankind's disrespectful pillaging of natural resources. The word Holy Ghost here, that deliberate proper noun, is a metonym for God himself, and the preposition over shows a place that God exists that is above everything, and it ascribes a protective overarching quality. The next part where it says the bent, we have pre-modifying adjective, and the world is misshapen due to human interference and exploitation. The world broods, that stative verb, which means to mull over something negative or to contemplate. Brood can also refer to the way a bird looks over its eggs. So there is a suggestion here of very deep thought, but also of God's protective, caring, loving nature. And the world broods with warm breast, and that imagery is very tender and very motherly. There is an intimacy in God and nature, and God will heal the earth and make it hospitable once more. His power is unlimited and easily dwarfs the hubris of mankind. The world can be healed. We have the exhalation "ah" at the end of the poem, and that is an exhalation of joy because of God's prevailing power. And it's one of the central messages that Hopkins wants us to see, is that belief in God should trump everything, and that is where we find our salvation. Now, the imagery of flight at the end of this poem shows that God has the capacity to elevate and resurrect the world. Now, God's healing of the world is inevitable, and nature will be preserved for the future. But it is uncertain if man will survive to accept a place in this resurrected world. Now, mankind might destroy themselves, but nature will live on in immortality. It gives this idea that nature is divine. And if we go through a blip of humans destroying the world will not be broken, it will return, but mankind may not. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it helps you to gain an understanding of the central ideas, the central themes, the central imagery, and the central messages that Hopkins wanted to share.